So today I am very honored to have a special guest, Michael Bryant, who probably many of you know, as he's been a very outspoken writer and speaker and having all things to do with the alleged pandemic, as they say, and the lack of any viruses. So he's been a major voice in that and been on the end of COVID and a number of things. Today, the subject, it came up because Michael sent me a article that you wrote, which we will link to, on lab leak, a tragic misdirection, I think it was called. And even though we've been over, or I've been over this subject, and the Baileys have been over it, and a lot of us have been over this subject many times, it really, like most of what I've seen, maybe even all of what I've seen from Michael, it was so clearly and succinctly written and so clear a case to be made that there is no lab leak, there was no pandemic, and it's easily demonstrated and proven. And this narrative needs to go. And so that's why I invited Michael to share with us how he came to that and his evidence for this. Before I turn it over to Michael and just sort of follow along, I wanted to just Michael, just say three reasons why I think this is so important. Because we hear often, like, Tom, just leave it alone and get along with everybody. You know, what's your problem? You're such a jerk. You know, just get along with people so they have a different opinion. What's the big deal? So here's the first reason. Um, I don't know if it's the first reason. Well, it's the first reason I'll give. So often you hear, and I've specifically heard segments from like the High Wire and on Mercola's site that, oh my God, we found out that Ebola is the cause of hemorrhagic fever, and Ebola turns out to be another Ralph Barrick and whoever else lab created virus. And isn't it horrible what they're doing? And look at us, and we caught them red-handed, right? We've all heard this. So the problem is, of course, as we will demonstrate and have demonstrate, there is no Ebola virus. There is no lab-created Ebola virus. And the reason that children in Africa get sick with hemorrhagic disease includes things like malnutrition, social displacement, poisoning the water, pharmaceutical drugs, vaccines, over-the-counter antibiotics, which are known to cause hemorrhagic disease, environmental toxicity, pesticides, cyanide in the water, and I could go on. Now, you could say, well, what is my proof that all those cause hemorrhagic disease? And there's a lot of it, which I don't need to go into. But the trouble is, if especially the opposition is agitating for the lab leaked virus as the cause, who's going to look into whether it's over-the-counter antibiotics and social displacement and rampant malnutrition and vaccinating these poor children up the wazoo and on and on and on? Those are the real crimes. I'm going to say that again. That is the crime here, not a lab leaked Ebola virus. And now I am not saying that these key prominent members, all of whom in the freedom community, all of whom have come out for the lab leak cause of COVID and Ebola and all that, are somehow in collusion. Like, I'm not saying that. They could be just ignorant of the science. Now, I don't know which is worse, to be ignorant of the science when that's supposedly your business, or to be in collusion with in a sort of or an accomplice in a sort of cover up of the real reasons. I suppose you could make a case that deliberately being an accomplice is worse, but being ignorant of the reasons people get sick and not calling for investigation and not blowing the whistle on that is pretty darn bad too. So I have no sympathy with that position, and so that's that is the first reason. We're never going to figure out why people get sick if we keep going down these false leads. So that's the first reason. The second reason is Michael is a great example of how to think about these things. For instance, we hear all the time. I mean, if we have an epidemic or a pandemic in this world, it's of sloppy thinking or logical fallacies. That's the pandemic. So you hear over and over again from the freedom community, people, doctors, et cetera. Well, we don't think there's we know we can demonstrate that nobody has shown there's a virus, and the first thing out of their mouth is, so what causes COVID? I mean, that is a anti-scientific, illogical, irrational question, because science and logic and rational thinking are based on there is a positive claim, you investigate it. You're saying, A, there is a COVID, B, it's caused by a virus, and Michael investigates those claims. It has no bearing on it whether he knows why those people got sick or not. I mean, he actually does have good ideas, but that's not the issue here. And until we figure that out, that there is a thinking process involved here, we're going to be an anti-scientific, illogical, irrational society. And my take on it is those kind of societies get manipulated and abused because they don't know how to see things properly. And the third reason I thought of is a lot of Michael's explanation will be about epidemiology, right? What happens in certain places. Now, we've all heard, correlation isn't causation, right? That's something we've all heard. And we've probably, most of us have heard that epidemiology is not there to prove causation. It's there to suggest things that should be investigated. But here's the problem, and I went over this, I don't know if you heard this, Michael, probably not, with MS. They did this 175 researchers at, Paris University and Oxford and Johns Hopkins, the genetics of MS, right? They find 233 different genomes in the people with MS, all of which were found in people who don't have MS. And I made the analogy, it's like you're investigating why people limp and you think it might be the color of their socks. And you find that people who limp have 233 different colored socks, all of which are found in people who don't limp. And any reasonable person would say, there's no connection between the color of your socks and limping. There's no even correlation to investigate whether it's a reasonable hypothesis. And I think what your paper and your work have demonstrated is there is no correlation to investigate here between a supposed infectious agent and an alleged disease. And so if there isn't even a correlation, it certainly can't be the cause. I mean, it's nothing to even investigate. Anyways, I'm going to stop there. And again, Michael, I'm really appreciative of you joining me, and I'm sort of going to turn the floor over to you. And I'm probably not going to say anything about how much I admired your tennis career, even though I did. I was, by the way, the #1 tennis player on my high school tennis team. even though I only played 1 year because I was the shortstop on the baseball team the other 2 years. So I'm familiar with tennis a little bit, but nothing like what you did. So, anyways, welcome and tell us a little about yourself and anything else, and then tell us about lab leaks.
Thanks, Tom. So that's quite an intro there, and I thought of two things. One was that the as relates to Ebola, I'm actually working on a longer article that goes into pretty deep detail on the Ebola fraud, but Ebola also the thing that's called Ebola serves foreign policy objectives too. So it goes,
Yeah.
it's got quite um, uh, a deep, what would you call it? There's a deep reservoir of intent or malintent and money involved in that whole narrative. And then the other was that, as you were
And that's
describing.
the point. It lets all that off the hook. It's just a lab leak.
That's right. That's it.
Get the
Yeah.
bad guy. The
And then the
wrong
other,
bad
just
guy, by the way.
real quick, how, science, and it's been this way for a long time, as you know, as science has taken a radical turn. Now it's just direct and at breakneck speed in the direction of money. It's just it's all about the money. But in any case, so I currently work for Health Freedom Defense Fund. That's with Leslie Manukian, and been working with her now for, I guess, over a year. I'm not sure exactly how long, maybe even 2 years. I do a lot of writing and research for her and with her, and that's been very fruitful for all of us, I think. And there's some others behind the scenes that help out a lot. And then I'm been a freelance writer for a while. Some of that's been sporadic over the last, I don't know what I'd say, 6, 8 years, but it's been really going pretty fast since all the madness of COVID set in. And some of my articles are published at various outlets like Global Research, Off Guardian, and all that stuff. So I think that's good enough for the intro on all the personal stuff. We'll get right into
Yeah, I
the
mean,
more.
at the end of the day, it doesn't matter who you are. It matters
Yeah,
what you say and how you substantiate what you're claiming.
that's how I view it. Yeah,
Yeah,
right. I always believe, look, everything I say is up for questioning. It's up for grabs. People hopefully will do that in an intellectual and intellectually rigorous and logical fashion. And I also don't hold any sacred cows. I don't hold Tom Cowan to be a sacred
yeah,
cow, or anybody. And uh, so yeah, I'm a believer in data, evidence, and rigorous thinking.
great.
So but to start this, why I wrote this piece was pretty much directed at the or towards the so-called health freedom movement. And the reason being, all of a sudden, here come these pieces again on lab leak. I thought that we had put this thing to bed maybe a couple of years ago, but fool that I am, here came another onrush of pieces about this. But these pieces were coming mainly from folks that we were to consider allies. Okay. So a confessional here. I'm a rabid Cardinal baseball fan. And in 2011, the St. Louis Cardinal baseball team was doing they weren't that good. And then all of a sudden, towards the end of the season, they went nuts with winning everything in sight. And they were completely out of the picture. Without getting in it too much, just all these unprecedented things began occurring to this team that the national baseball scene couldn't ignore. Next thing you know, they're in the playoffs. These weird things keep happening, just unbelievably odd things happening to this team in late stages of the season, late stages of the games. They go on to win the World Series. They win the whole shebang. Well, their announcer, as this is happening, has this what became sort of their signature phrase. At the end of the game, when these miraculous, bizarre things would be happening, he would say, "They just won't go away." And it
Oh,
was like the zombies. And so I was thinking about this as relates to this lab leak thing. And I'm thinking, you know what? I've got to write a piece here. I've got to figure out a way that we can put this zombie to rest once and for all, because it
Yeah.
just won't go away. And so
Right.
that,
I want to put this baby to rest too. I'm sick of it.
yeah, yeah. So in any case, that is the funny little sports anecdote that came to my mind is over and over as I was writing this piece. So with no further ado, I'd say we get right into it then.
Yeah.
Okay.
Let's put it to rest.
Okay. So I won't read the introduction to it. That's just sort of a colorful entry
Do
point
you need
from
to
myself.
share your screen, by the way?
I
Or
don't know how to do that, Tom. I'm afraid I would.
yeah, okay.
I
That's
would.
fine.
I should have asked that.
It's
Yeah.
okay.
Yeah. I'm not the most technologically savvy person you'll
I'm
find by
not
a long.
either. So
Yeah.
it's the blind leading the blind.
Yeah. So, um, but the first, when I was going to write this piece, then because of the absurdity of the whole lab leak um, ideology or cult or theory or whatever you want to call it, I was almost going to try to do a Monty Python-esque um, um, version of this. But as it turns out, as I'm often accurately accused of, I'm just in these kind of things ultimately a super serious person, and so it didn't. I wasn't able to pull off the lampoon portion of it very well. But it's kind of a colorful introduction. So read that if you and you'll get a sense for what I'm saying. There's just the idea of the lab leak bioweapon gain of function narrative is just absolutely absurd. It's
Got it.
absurd. So,
All right.
so anyway, let's get into some of the more the meatier portions of the paper, which speak to just the data and evidence that is or there that contradicts this theory and the data or evidence that is not there. Okay, so the first thing that I bring up as far as an oddity that would cause someone to question the validity of this lab leak theory is how this so-called virus, this COVID virus, just struck without warning. So if you go back and you look at the data in early 2020, you'll see that, or we can even take that back to late 2019. There was just no observable evidence anywhere in the world that there was a mass death event or even a mass morbidity event that was occurring or that was in the offing. And we're talking about hospital data, okay? And we're talking about surveillance data from various national health agencies. So there's nothing happening anywhere, and I would challenge anybody to bring data forward that contradicts what I just said, and I'd be very interested in seeing that. But
Michael, let me stop you for a minute just to get on the same page. So we're talking about the claim is there was a virus that was manipulated through a laboratory procedure that was either inadvertently or deliberately leaked out into the world and that caused a infectious disease pandemic all over the world. That's the claim.
That's the story we're supposed to believe, and yet we're not seeing. And let's backtrack just a little bit there. This lab leak story wasn't something that he came up after the so-called COVID death event. This was being floated in February 2020. So, but nowhere are we seeing that this alleged lab leak pathogen was creating any medical event of any magnitude whatsoever that was noted, tracked, and traced on any surveillance system in any state, nation, or region in the world.
Got it.
Right?
Yeah, let me say one more thing. We're also, just to be clear, we're also talking about that there's been modifications of the gain of function virus, like clone DNA virus or clone DNA pathogen or non-transmissible biological agent. So we're including all those sort of things in this category. Is that your understanding as well?
Yes, that's correct.
Yeah.
I would, Tom, I'd go even a step further because we're seeing that some people are now backing off of this lab leak story, and even backing off of the quote unquote viral contagion story as relates to COVID somewhat, and suggesting it could have been other things, could have been chemical releases and all this sort of thing. I'd challenge those as well. I would just challenge anybody to show me any evidence whatsoever that there was any medical event, any medical emergency of magnitude anywhere in the world leading up to the week the WHO declared a global pandemic in mid-March 2020.
Got
There's
it.
just no data or evidence to support that I've seen.
Got
I've
it.
spent 2,000 hours on this stuff right now. So
Okay, so in other words,
yeah,
first step, nothing happened before the WHO announced the pandemic, right?
that's correct. And so then the WHO declares a pandemic, and this all of a sudden this explosion goes off, or we're led to believe this virus is galloping around the world, causing this mass sickness, mass mortality event. And so my question to that is, how is this microbe trained to be released only on an administrative order and then to peak in synchronicity only in select locations? So did this suddenly super spreading, deadlier than flu, gain of function, magical virus wait for a government decree to create these excess deaths? And a huge question along with this is the story we're led to believe is this lab leak occurred in Wuhan, China. Okay, so if you go back and look at the data there, there was no mass mortality event there. So why was there no mass death in the very Chinese city where this lab leak is said to have originated?
Got it. So in other words, at first step, epidemiology doesn't make any sense.
The data and evidence do not support the claim that a lab leak originated in this city and that this quote unquote virus caused a mass death event in that city of where this lab leak supposedly originated.
Got it. Okay.
Okay, so the next, the next question that I bring up in this article is that this virus, we are told, the first place we were told this mass death event occurred of significance. There was a little bit of an outlier in Iran, but we'll leave that aside. It was in northern Italy. Okay, and so when we look at the data from and I'm talking about creating a mass morbidity and mass mortality event, not what happened in supposedly happened in Washington State. Okay, I'm going to leave that aside as well. But how is it that this virus, when it was impacting Italy, impacted only northern Italy, and in fact only impacted specific regions of northern Italy? You'll see that there are Italy's broken up into multiple regions, and in the north, it's almost like a checkerboard where this virus would impact one region purportedly, not impact a region that was neighboring it, then somehow jumped over that region and then impacted another region next to the region which wasn't impacted, and then we saw that again. Okay, how does a virus, how is it designed? How does this gain of function design work so that it can give this virus those kind of superpowers? And then how was it that this virus didn't migrate immediately from Northern Europe all the way up, or northern Italy, all the way up through and around Europe, but instead it hop, skipped, and jumped over to a public hospital in Elmhurst, New York. Okay, and interestingly, just as far as if we want to be have a raised eyebrow on the name of where it happened, Elmhurst is in the Corona neighborhood of Queens, New York City, which is kind of interesting. I'm not trying to be too conspiratorial there, but that might be,
Just in case you missed that.
that might come up in a Jeopardy question some years down the line. So keep that in mind if you're, asked to.
So let me see if I get this right. This may be a good way for us to do this. Again, I'm following the claim based on the facts. So the claim is they made this either gain of function transmissible virus or a non-transmissible bioweapon or a clone DNA or one of the various permutations. It was released in Wuhan, and somehow there wasn't an increased morbidity or mortality in the place it was released. And then it somehow jumped to various regions of northern Italy. Particularly, I know I'm jumping ahead, but had certain health-related situations that didn't happen in the adjacent regions. So you had increased morbidity and mortality in very specific regions of northern Italy, not in the adjacent one, and then in the next one. And then it didn't go to the rest of Europe like you would think, but instead jumped over to the Corona District Elmhurst Hospital in New York, where was the next place you saw an increased morbidity and mortality. And how is it that a spreadable pathogen or a non-transmissible pathogen could do such a thing? Is that?
That's pretty accurate. Now, I would just want to put a fine point on the Italian story, and there are a couple articles you'll find at Health Freedom Defense that go into the Italian situation pretty specifically, and so I won't go into it too much. But one thing that's really important in that part of the story is that Italy has some autonomous regions, and those autonomous regions are they will often be neighboring other Italian regions. There are 5 of these autonomous regions. They will neighbor other Italian regions which are not so designated. These autonomous regions are not tied as much to the federal administrative dictates and the funding therein in the nation of Italy. And specifically, they are not as dependent in the health sector on fulfilling, let's just say, for lack of a better term, administrative mandates that the Italian national government will lay down. And of interest, I hope I'm explaining this clearly, of interest is that the autonomous regions in northern Italy, which are sitting both to the east and the west, okay, of these regions that were supposedly impacted, so it couldn't have just been a gust of wind, were the ones that were not impacted, and the ones that were impacted, the regions that were impacted in northern Italy, were tied directly to these government mandates. Okay, and those mandates were included the protocols, which we'll talk about just a little bit, I believe.
Got it. So in other words,
hospital protocols.
You have this bizarre situation where it seems like the morbidity and the mortality is much more clearly explained by relationship to government policies than it is any of the so-called biological events.
Yes, that's correct.
Got it. Okay. Whoop, I think we lost your sound there. Michael, I think you muted yourself.
We would not be.
Michael, you muted yourself, I think.
Well, nope, it should still be
Yeah.
working.
Yeah, that's good. Okay.
Okay. Yeah, just what I said there was if it was a highly transmissible virus, then these patterns should not be what we are have observed and what the data and evidence illustrate.
Or even if it was a targeted bioweapon, I mean, you would have to postulate somehow which, a specific target that was tied to government mandates or dictates, which is a bizarre theory.
Yes, I would again I would argue the same with a chemical release. I think
Yeah,
that's
right.
simply not possible to make that so specific, and
Yeah,
it gets even more specific in where these so-called lab leak deaths occurred. So yeah, so the first wave of the COVID deaths in the U.S. and this was the same in Italy, northern Italy. It was in nursing homes and hospitals. It wasn't in the general population, and this wasn't the case where we were seeing those in the general population um, get impacted by this, and then they were brought to the hospitals. Okay, and of course the same is true with nursing homes, as those residents are already there. These were largely inpatient individuals who were already in the hospitals. So how is it this lab leak pathogen targeted these institutions and blanketed them so completely? And how was it that this virus was so demographically intelligent, and how is it possible that there were other things at work? And as you mentioned in the opening, there are with the virus story overall, why it is so important, and specifically as relates to this virus story and the misdirection of the lab leak pathogen. It covers up crimes that we have a lot of evidence for that we're not talking about because we're constantly having this lab leak pathogen nonsense thrown in our face. Um, so were maybe the high rate of deaths in hospitals and nursing homes due to the dangerous protocols? Well, there's an abundance of evidence for that. I don't know that anybody's trying to argue that point too much
yeah,
anymore within the so-called health freedom movement. What about the unilateral do not resuscitate orders?
yeah.
What about what we can say were purposeful policies of neglect? Okay. There's just an abundance of evidence that calls into question what was happening within the hospitals relating in nursing homes relating to people who are already there. Okay. And that's to my mind what one of the things that we should be looking at, and to insist upon some external TV reality show pathogen being the cause of that is to I believe aid and abet by covering up crimes that happened within these hospitals.
Got it. So in other words, this situation is very clearly and easily explained by abusive and destructive policies in nursing homes, in hospitals, in this New York City area, and probably other nursing homes that clearly would account for the the things that we were seeing. No pathogen, no chemical weapon needed to explain this.
Correct. Yes, and most of the people in this, so-called first wave were poor, and many were disabled.
Yeah,
I forget the actual number, but I want to say it's around 13 million in the United States. Whatever the number is, there's a large pool of individuals that are in that disabled category, and that category can include uh, individuals with dementia, individuals um, who have severe chronic um, uh, comorbidities already. And then, as we know, there's also a large category of impoverished people in this country. And so, how was it that this Frankenstein virus was programmed to avoid upper middle class and wealthy people?
Yeah.
And we don't need a viral event to explain this. The poor and the already sick are more susceptible to any disease.
Yeah. And poor care because they don't have advocates and they don't do it themselves and they don't, they have a lot of things that maybe they don't have access to.
That's right. Yeah.
Got it.
So, and then, and during that first wave, also in the United States, um, relating to what we were talking about in northern Italy, we saw that same phenomena where certain counties and metro areas in certain states in the United States were impacted, while neighboring regions adjacent to these areas were not affected at all. Okay, and even within some of those counties, they would be right next to other counties that were not impacted at all. And then somehow this virus in the New York City metro region, if you look at the data for how that virus supposedly played out there, it seems that the virus was unable to cross the river in certain locations. So how does that work? How does this hobgoblin recognize county, state, national boundaries,
Right.
and just mainly stick to urban areas and not impact neighboring suburban areas and pretty much left the rural communities alone?
Yeah. So in other words, again, this is why I brought up the epidemiology correlation, which is not even the first step towards developing a hypothesis as to cause, isn't there, right? It's just not there.
Right. And, Tom, how I approach a lot of this too is just with a basic question. I ask myself, is it logical?
Yeah.
Does this make sense? It's, for I leave it to the others to get into the deeper science of the uh, lab leak pathogen story. Others are better equipped to do that, and I have certainly looked into that as well, and that adds another layer of absurdity to the whole story. But I think if you lay these facts out to the layperson and they're looking at just the data and evidence for this, they can at the very least say, "Hey, wait a minute, this is illogical. This simply does not make sense. This
Yeah.
doesn't make basic sense." So,
Right.
yeah. So then the another aspect of this, which is curious. I like to kind of be a little cheeky with this one. Is I just believe that let's accept that there is a bioweapon out there that they designed and released onto the world from a lab in Wuhan, China. Well, I feel like that should then almost be a cause for celebration, right? Because we've seen that this thing was only able to impact, not to be too, not to use too much dark humor here, but it's only impacting the elderly and the super sickly, people who already have one foot in the grave. So that virus just seemed to jump over children and younger adults, and all the able and healthy people didn't get impacted, by it. It seems so. That seems like it was a bit of a dud if it was a lab leaked
So
demonic
you're
entity.
talking about looking at the morbidity and mortality data before the vaccine, so-called, was introduced, right?
That's right. And, most of my focus in this particular paper has to do with that spring event of 2020 and events leading into it. We're not talking about winter 2020 and beyond.
Yeah.
We're just, laser like focus on, okay, what happened in that massive mortality event and leading up to it.
So in other
in
words, the
May
case to be
2020.
made from a epidemiology point of view, and now we're looking at what about children, what about young adults, all of whom are allegedly uh, supposed to be impacted by viruses for which we have no, quote, immunity to, which is itself a whole story. But if you look at, supposedly smallpox or polio, or these were non-discriminatory viruses that affected young people, healthy people. In fact, some of them they would claim that would more preferentially affect healthy people. That's itself a whole different story. But here we have a situation where before any treatment, like i.e., injections were rolled out. In other words, the pure part of it would just, you could say, just from the pathogen, it was only the sick and worst off people, poor and and administratively bamboozled people who actually died and got really sick.
Yeah, that's correct. And I would add to the um, uh, treatment narrative that this would also hold for the early treatment narrative, in that this is another one of those Trojan horses or mythologies that, oh, if only we had had early treatment, and they were withholding that as they were waiting for the vaccine to come online. We would have been okay. We could have saved these patients. Well, no, there was never any need for any early treatment whatsoever. There was no need for ivermectin. There was no need for hydroxychloroquine, in my view. There was no need for any of this stuff. What we were dealing with was deadly treatments that were occurring in hospitals, and deadly treatments that were occurring in nursing homes. And we have a lot of evidence to support that hypothesis, and all of these other red herrings take us away from that. So I'm not of the opinion that the early treatment narrative has any value whatsoever either, except to distract from just the hardcore realities of what happened in spring 2020.
Yeah. So if I could to just summarize that, we hear that, oh, if they should have let everybody have ivermectin. But the reality is there weren't people who needed to be treated, uh, in that time before this, quote, injections anyway. So what is that about? Is that,
Yes, yeah. What were they being treated for? They were to be treated for some fictional entity. No, that what was happening to these people was they were being assaulted. So stop them from being assaulted. Don't accept the a priori assumption that these individuals needed to be treated.
yeah. You know, one could imagine that the a certain segment of the healthy people had a kind of almost like propaganda or fear-induced like illness, that they would claim this was different and that they needed early treatment. And so you will probably have people claiming that I'm different, I got sick and I needed early treatment. But what you're saying is if you just look at the data, you don't see even that phenomena happen.
Yes, so let's take that story and run with it a little bit. Wouldn't we then see hospital admissions rise? Wouldn't we
Yeah.
see emergency department visits rise? And we didn't see that. We saw quite the opposite.
Just say a little bit more about that.
So let's just say that let's even put the lab leak hypothesis aside for just a little bit, and let's say that there was even some sort of uh, chemical assaults, or there was some psychologically induced um, uh, medical event that occurred. Now, I'm speaking specifically again of the spring 2020 timeframe. Would we not see that in hospital data? Would we not see that in emergency department visit and 911 calls? This kind of data, right? So I'd like to see that data if someone has that. Where what we have seen is quite the opposite. You will see that the emergency department visits were dropping to all-time lows in most all places. The same with hospital visit data. And yes, people were being told to stay away from the hospitals, but certainly if we were having some sort of cataclysm of the type we were told occurred, we would see that that data couldn't possibly look the way it does.
Right. And
There wouldn't have
I've
been.
actually seen your data and your information you're talking about. And I think, again, correct me if I'm wrong, but what you're saying is no matter what you tell people, if there was some major event happening, there would be increased utilization of ICUs, ERs, across more or less uniform across the country. It wouldn't be geographic boundaries or rivers, or I guess that's a geographic bound, or poverty, or who has Medicare, or who this or that. And in fact, you see the opposite.
That's correct. Yeah, I guess the one thing we did see a massive uptick in was the utilization of PCR test kits.
Yeah, right.
So, but no, the data and the evidence shows that whatever story one wants to concoct, the data and the evidence do not support the belief that there was a massive medical event out in the general population in spring of 2020.
Yeah. Which is essentially what this whole thing is based on, right? If it didn't happen then, it didn't happen ever, because that's
a very, very important point, and in fact, we could narrow that down too. You could say this whole event was sold to people, and this is why myself and some other colleagues focus so much on these two places. This entire event was sold to people based on what the media was screaming to everybody happened in northern Italy. What the media was screaming was happening to everybody in New York City. You take those two places away from this control narrative, this big scamdemic, and the entire story collapses, which is why we need to get away from this madness of the lab leak pathogen narrative, the gain of function narrative within the health freedom movement, so that we can, get these entities and individuals who have the resources, have copious resources and influence to focus their resources on the concrete evidence that we already have out there, and then explore that evidence more in detail so that we can look for the possibility of prosecutions, the possibility of deeper legal inquiries. This isn't just an abstract academic discussion. People need to understand nothing's been proven, okay, about this COVID story. All right, we don't have a single death certificate from New York City in 2020. Why not? Shouldn't there be a memorial for all of the people that died then? Wouldn't there be yearly rituals to commemorate the brave nurses and doctors that sacrificed their lives for this, and the people that died? We don't have any of these items happening.
Michael, what do you mean by we don't have a single death certificate from that time? What do you mean by that?
Well, in New York State, you don't have to provide a death certificate. And in fact, even through Freedom of Information Act, due to a law that was passed in 1949 in New York State, you can't obtain death certificates. So we're told this spring event, this concentrated time period of 11, 12 weeks, produced 37,000 deaths in New York City. And those were right around, I want to say, 26,000 excess deaths. Forgive me if I am not exact with those numbers, but pretty
Yeah.
close. We don't have any death certificates. How do we know those people died? How do we know those people who they're telling us died? And I'm not saying those people didn't die, but what I am saying is, where's the evidence for that? Those
Yeah.
numbers, okay? And there is good evidence to say there may have also been data fraud to conjure up those numbers, okay, to incite the fear, okay, to make this event appear to be more cataclysmic, okay. So
So in other
all
words, and so this gets into the other problem with the lab leak story is it in by definition accepts the pandemic story, which is a fear-inducing control-based narrative story, which uh, is really what the problem is.
yes, and this, just accepting this supposition distracts us from recognizing that we go back and look at some of the events of 2020. We see these were staged. There were staged Hollywood productions.
Yeah.
We have doomsday models. We have spuriously attributed deaths from all these other causes, fraudulently manufactured cases with these meaningless PCR tests. And why are we not examining those, not just in an academic fashion? And I'm talking about the totality of the health freedom movement. Why are we not zeroing in on these things, saying, wait a minute, these were all fraud. Let's get some legal teeth into investigations that are exploring these.
Right.
Okay. Let's and so this pandemic narrative is concealing all of these things, distracting us from all of these things, and concealing the likelihood that there was what I call a mass murder spree that was set off by these policies that were orchestrated and mandated by identifiable individuals, okay, that are have benefited the wealthiest people in the world, okay, that are just steamrolling the rest of the people's lives, okay, and perpetuating this lab leak story serves to cover all of this up. Now, I
Right.
think it's important to note too, and I'm not questioning anybody's motives. I'm not impugning anybody's motives. This is all irrelevant. All of that stuff is irrelevant to me. I just
Yeah.
want to see the data and the evidence and keep pursuing these sorts of things. However, I think you have to look at it and say, you know what, this perpetuation of the lab leak story and that the pandemic story itself serves a purpose that is financially benefiting certain people within the health industry movement. And these people are continuously catapulting this lab leak pathogen,
Yeah.
okay, and the validity of the pandemic narrative that COVID is a unique disease that needs to be treated by these alternative treatments. And so
It doesn't really matter whether they're doing that um, volitionally, intentionally or knowingly. It does matter some, but or they just don't understand and don't want to understand actual science and data.
Yes, and I think that they have either an ideological and or financial commitment to that narrative that disallows them from looking at this data and evidence. Some of them I know for a fact will not look at this from
Yeah.
firsthand experience, I should say, will not even look at this data and this evidence. And I can only speculate on why that is. I don't think
Yeah.
that that's anything that matters that much if the end result is the same.
Yeah.
Okay. And these are the individuals and institutions that have the most power, the most
Right.
authority, the most resources within the health freedom community. And so, what another problem is that saps the political will from being amassed to investigate,
Yeah.
these pieces of evidence, mountains of evidence, I would say, that point to an entirely different situation
Yeah.
that brought about this.
In other words, the movement of well-intentioned, well-meaning people to do right by the world and find out what happened is being manipulated and misled, whether intentionally or not, we don't know, and doesn't even really matter. But that is a death blow to the possibility of truth winning out.
That's right, and I think that's something that needs to be confronted head on in the health freedom movement.
Yeah,
So,
I agree.
these health freedom advocates who have the greatest attention of the greatest number of people are in fact the ones that are doing the bidding of the biosecurity state.
Yes.
As long as they keep this fear going through this gain of function boogeyman, these people with great influence just keep creating fertile ground for future terror campaigns.
Yeah.